Welcome to the Sunshine Parenting Podcast. My name is Audrey Monkey, and I am your host. I write, research, speak, and interview podcast guests on the topics of summer camp, parenting, and happiness. In episode 13 of the podcast, I'm talking with author Heather Haupt about her book, Knights in Training, 10 Principles for Raising Honorable, Courageous, and Compassionate Boys. Heather, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. To start with, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and why you wrote the book, Knights in Training, 10 Principles for Raising Honorable, Courageous, and Compassionate Boys?
Well, yes, my name is Heather, and I have 4 children. My older 3 are boys. They are 13, 11, and 9, and then I have a little girl who is 5. And we started this foray into the idea of night training about 6.5 years ago, and it started simply by reading a book about knights, and my boys were mesmerized. And so as they were waging sword battles all around me, because that's what they wanted to do after reading a book about knights, I saw it and said, whoa, I'm onto something here. Look at how engaged they are. This is the time I'm going to take to talk to them about chivalry, because I want my boys to understand how to treat the women in their life with dignity and respect. And so I went and started researching, how do I want to do this? And that's when I discovered that chivalry was so much more than how a man treats a woman. That was just a small aspect, but it really was just a code of conduct, a way of living. It was actually not codified in the Middle Ages as 10 steps to be an amazing man, but the principles were woven into the medieval literature. And so when I started looking at that, and I realized how timeless these principles were, to defend and protect those that are weak, to stand against injustice, to always speak the truth, to do your best in everything, to persevere even when life gets tough. I saw those principles and I said, wow, this is what I want for my sons. And so I printed it up in a really cool font, burned the edges, and I posted this Knight's Code of Chivalry in my home, and I called the boys over and I said, boys, we are going to do night training. And they're like, with swords and everything? And I said, yes. And we're going to learn to embody not only the skills that a knight had, but really his heart, because that is where his true strength lies. And so I read to them the Code of Chivalry, and I said, this is what I'm calling you to live up to. Are you up to the challenge? And they gave a resounding yes. And it was so beautiful to watch them, even at those ages. And at that time, they were 6, 4, and almost 3. And at that point in time, they really took to it, and they wanted to embody the heart of a modern day knight. And so they started being on the lookout for ways that they could live out chivalry in their day-to-day lives. And as I've looked back over the 6.5 years, I've realized how much this has changed our family. It's changed the way we communicate with one another. It's given my husband and I a sense of purpose, that this is their training phase. And it's given the boys a sense of purpose, that they are growing up to be amazing men, and that they have opportunities even now to live this out in their daily lives.
Oh, that is just awesome. It's funny because I had 3 girls first and then 2 boys. And it really is true when you were writing about in your book, it talks about how they're just drawn to create weapons, even when you try to keep them from having them. So I love that whole part that you wrote about how, rather than fighting this kind of innate desire to use weapons, you embraced it. And really, I love how you even codified, when you're doing a sword fight with your foam swords, here are the guidelines. I love that how you're, instead of just saying, don't do that, you instead let them do it and used it as a way to teach them, character traits.
Yeah. So you don't say no and you don't give them carte blanche. You put on, here's how to do it with honor. Mm-hmm.
Well, it was funny because, of course, my boys are older now. They're 13 and 16. And so we didn't do swords, but they loved, we talked about Jedi Star Wars things, and they had a lot of lightsabers around. And I think, again, that was I remember one of my sons had a Jedi birthday party. And we did like a little training thing for Jedis. And it's just interesting. It reminded me of that, just, how they stand up so straight and they're so proud as they, have their, their sword or their lightsaber or that kind of thing. So that really resonated with me. Also, interestingly enough, at my summer camp, we do riflery and archery. So it's target shooting only. And, sometimes parents are a little taken aback that we are teaching kids about weapons. But one of the things I've always said is we're really teaching respect for these weapons. It's only target shooting. And I feel very confident that especially when it comes to the guns or the rifles that we're using, I mean, we're very clear that, this is, you never aim it at a person. When you're carrying it out to the target range, it's always facing up and unloaded. So I feel very confident that the kids who've been through our program are very respectful and not going to be the kind of kids who would like come across a weapon and, accidentally fire it or use it on a person. So I think this whole thing of introducing kids and teaching them about these things is very important.
Yeah. And then tying it in with respect for the weapon, respect for themselves, and respect for others. And when we do that, we're really equipping our children to walk out successfully into life and into interacting with these kinds of situations.
Oh, most definitely. So I'm curious, so now that your older son, you said, is 13 now, how often or how much does your night training still come up for him at this age?
Yeah, well, we've sort of cycled through, had periods where we focused on it more intensely. So initially we did it for a couple of months, and then we had a little knighting ceremony and made it official. But we let them know that really night training was through the entirety of childhood. And so we were going to be working on this for the rest of their boyhood years. And so there was that in mind. But then we've had points in time where we've just, like when we moved, I didn't put up the Knight's Code of Chivalry when we moved to Texas 2.5 years ago. But then about 1.5 years ago, when I started thinking through, like, yeah, I'm going to write this book, we put it up again. We pulled out the books. We read about it. We talked about it. What's interesting with it is the principles are really timeless. And once you understand, like even just with that initial period of night training, we would just sort of reference that because every boy wants to be respected. And so we would tie it back with, wow, you have an opportunity here to garner respect as you are trustworthy and you are a truth teller in this situation. And so when we're walking into situations where they might be tempted to speak in untruthful ways to cover up lies, we will sort of address it again and tie it back in. What we've tried to do over the years is to really spot areas of growth that we've seen in our boys and highlight that. Because a lot of parenting is reactive, where we're like, don't do that, don't do this, that's very bad, here's a consequence. And sometimes there has to be that. We have to be the strict, what I call mean mom, where we enforce rules and guidelines, but we also try to incorporate as much as we can affirmation. And so when we see them behaving in strong, manly ways, and just strong ways as a person, identifying that and going, wow, you had an opportunity to try to lie here, and we're really proud of you that you came clean and you spoke the truth. That's a sign of growth and strength. And so we'll sort of tie it back in, maybe not like this aspect of the code you lived out, but the code has become so ingrained in our boys that we can highlight it without making it a major lesson, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. I think we talk a lot about camp about catching kids doing something right, and how it's that same idea that we really want to embrace and let kids know that we see the good they're doing, and we're not just going to be there pointing out everything that goes wrong. And once you start pointing out the good things they're doing, they do more of them. So that's definitely along with, I love that philosophy of these affirmations, especially for boys who I feel like often in our world are kind of being told a lot that, being too active is wrong and some of the things that they do. So it's so great when they understand that we're seeing these great things that they're doing as well.
Yeah, which even with the active thing, like we'll prepare them before we go into a situation like, okay, here you can't be crazy. You're going to have to be a man, a boy under control. But then afterwards, we're going to go out to the park and you can go crazy and we can run laps, you can do whatever. But even just acknowledging, hey, we know you need to move. We know you need to act crazy sometimes. This is not the time and place. But don't worry, we've got your back. You can do it later. And so even doing that, sort of preparing them in advance for those situations where they do need to exhibit a lot greater self-control. It's more challenging, I guess, for them than for a girl walking into those situations.
Oh, definitely. I read somewhere that if you let kids, boys especially, play for 10 minutes, run around on a playground before school, they'll pay attention better than even like medications that are used for ADHD. And it's just, if schools and were more set up with more recess, more running around, that would solve a lot of the behavioral problems that I think teachers face, especially with boys.
Absolutely. Yes.
I mean, we have at camp, the kids are pretty much getting exercise all day long and very active. And we just have very few issues, even with kids who supposedly have a lot of issues in other settings because of that just constant activity. It helps them behave so much.
Yes. Yeah. There's a huge mind body component. And as we embrace a boy's need to move, it makes life so much easier for them and for us.
Oh, most definitely. So I wanted to ask you, just as we finish up. So one of my friends, a book she wrote, it was actually geared towards teenage girls. It's called Get Savvy. And I interviewed her recently for a podcast. She talked about different kinds of men, noble males and conquest males. And the reason I really wanted to talk to you, because I loved how basically a noble male is a chivalrous male or a knight. So what specifically are you doing with your boys to raise them to be noble males who kind of respect women and also defend them against perhaps conquest males who are trying to maybe potentially harm them?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it comes down to we focus on how we are on sameness before differences. And so that we're all human beings worthy of dignity and respect. And so especially I think in the early years, just laying that foundation of, they are people too. They're different, but they're people first and foremost. And we respect other people. But then we also acknowledge and celebrate differences. And so boys have this thing called testosterone, which enables them to they have different body builds. They're able to develop strength to a greater capacity than women, physical strength. And so we talk to our sons about utilizing your strength to defend and to protect and never, ever to prey on a woman. But then we also talk about just differences and how we each have different strengths. And so you might have greater physical strength, but girls and women, they bring their own unique set of strengths to humanity. And so pinpointing what those are, highlighting those and celebrating that. And so we do that in our family. My husband and I will talk about how we're both very different. And yet when we learn to recognize and celebrate our differences, we're stronger together. And so we just regularly remind our boys that when you embrace those differences, that we have an opportunity as a society to be stronger, but you have been gifted with the capacity for greater physical strength, and you are to use that to defend the women in your life against men that are abusing their strength. And so highlighting that and giving our boys that charge that you need to be there to stand up and to defend your friends, your sisters, your mom, someday your own wife.
Yeah, I love the story. Why don't you share just that story from the football game that you share in the book that I think is just a really good example of how you saw some noble males stepping in?
Yeah, we had a group of college friends, and each year we would get seats at the 50-yard line at our college football games. And I remember going with a friend of mine. I invited a friend from my chemistry class, and we were sitting on the third row. We had 3 rows, and there was a guy behind me who had snuck in liquor and had poured it into his Coke. And so he was just making all kinds of derogatory comments at the players, at my friend and I. And at the time I had long hair and I had him in braids, and he's dipping his lace liquor-laced Coke in my braids and just harassing us. And two guys from our group that I wasn't even that close with. I mean, I knew them, but they saw what was happening and they just looked at us and they said, hey, let's switch places. And they had my friend and I move down a row and they took up the place behind us. And so they never even talked to the guy. So it's not like they confronted him, but they put themselves between us and that guy, and he calmed down. And I don't know if the guy left. I just don't remember anything after that, except feeling so appreciative that they saw that and that they took that step to put themselves physically between us and that man who was sexually harassing us.
I'm going to share that story with my teenage boys and read that part of your book to them, because I just love that example that it doesn't require, getting in a big fight or confronting people, but just stepping between, someone who is more of a conquest or not respectful male. That is what we need our boys to learn to do.
Yeah, I spoke at a conference this last weekend, and a mother came up and told me a very similar story that happened with her 18-month-old and her 4-year-old. And her 18-month-old was a girl, and this little boy at the playground was coming up with a big stick, getting ready to hit her 18-month-old, and she was pregnant and just not able to get up in time. And she's going, oh no, what's going to happen? And her 4-year-old saw this other kid and ran over and just stood between this little boy with the stick and his sister. And he didn't say anything. He just stood there and gave this boy the eye. And the boy put his stick down, turned around, and walked away.
That is so awesome. That is amazing. And see, that's the thing. And then by reinforcing that with the 4-year-old and saying, that was so great. You were being noble and respectful and protecting, and then you reinforce that, and then they learn to do it more.
Yes. Yes.
That is just awesome. Well, one of the things, why don't you talk a little bit about the format of your book and how you have these really great kind of games and activity suggestions for each of the different character traits so that parents will understand how they can use your book?
Yeah. So I love reading research books. What's the difference between boys and girls? How can we parent more effectively? But a lot of times we'll talk theoretical stuff. And so I loved including studies in my book, but I really wanted my book to be practical. And so I have a chapter on each aspect of the code. There's 10 aspects. And so I talk in each chapter about what it meant for the knights of old. So giving historical context, what it means for our boys today, why it's so vitally important. And so this is where I share stories and inspiration. But then I end each chapter with a throw down the gauntlet section where I equip you as the parent to issue your sons the challenge. And so here's where I have things to discuss with your sons, games to play, skills to work on, so that they can be prepared practically to live out each aspect of the code. And so I really wanted to lay it out in a way sort of as a resource guide so that when you're encountering maybe problems with a certain aspect of the code, like maybe your son's struggling with lying and he's not being truthful, that you could go back and look at that chapter again and sort of get some handle on what are some ways that I can address this with him that will inspire him to speak truth. And so I have that practical aspect at the end of each chapter, which really I think is just helpful for us as parents, because we could be doing great in one area and then suddenly they slide or they're struggling with something. And so here's where we can go back and really help bolster them up and inspire them.
Yes, that's awesome. I think also just one of the things that struck me about your book is just the intentionality of parenting, and whether or not parents want to use a knight code or they have their own 5 character traits that are what they value most. It's just realizing that we have this important role of keeping circling back with our kids on these values that are important to us. So even if parents choose to only use, 1 or 2 of your chapters, it's really useful to have kind of guidelines and to intentionally talk with and train our kids in some of these areas.
Yeah, and that's the key, is just being intentional and circling back, because our kids are in process and they're not going to get it the first time we tell them. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know that we fail in many of these areas too. And it's just circling back and going over it again and doing reminders that is where we will succeed with our parenting.
Definitely. Heather, tell us where else people can find you and your work and your speaking if they want to follow more of what you're doing.
Yeah, I have all of that information on my website, heatherhaupt.com. And yeah, I love speaking is my favorite thing. I love meeting people in person and talking about these things. And so you can find out information there. I have old blog posts, more information on the book. And then I love to hang out on Facebook. I have an author page there. And then over on Instagram, I have both a personal Instagram account and then just one devoted to Knights in Training and raising up these boys of ours.
Okay, amazing. I will put links on the page about this blog post, about this podcast. I will put links to all of your different sites so that people can follow your work. And I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about your book. I really enjoyed it. Wish I had had it when my boys were younger, but I think it's still never too late to raise knights. And maybe these teenage years are even more applicable to talk about some of these principles.
In many ways, absolutely yes.
Okay, thank you so much for your time, Heather. Have a great rest of your summer, and I'm sure we'll be in touch and stay connected. I hope I get to hear you speak in person at some point.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me on.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
I enjoyed talking with Heather about her book. For notes and links to information we discussed in this episode of the podcast, visit my website at sunshine-parenting.com and search for episode 13. I'll end this episode of the podcast with a quote from Heather's book, Knights in Training, 10 Principles for Raising Honorable, Courageous, and Compassionate Boys. Why do we want to introduce our boys to the grand stories of knights? Not so they can engage in bloody battles and return to feudalism. Instead, we want to inspire them to embody the ideals of chivalry, to encourage them that evil can and should be fought, and to help them overcome their own weaknesses and selflessly display courage in helping others.